you about different settings for your quilt. So for now, I'm going to talk to you about straight settings and on-point setting. So a straight setting on a quilt, you're going to recognize these blocks. These are the blocks that I did the Wonky coping strips on. The blocks are cut wonky, but they're done with a straight set. So straight sets mean that it's going to have sashings and cornerstones between the blocks, going all the way around the blocks. So this quilt is done with a straight set, and this one under here is also. So here you see my New York Beauty blocks, and they're straight with sashings and cornerstones in them. The next ones I'm going to show you are going to be on-point settings. Let me tell you about on-point settings. Putting a quilt on point does two things. First, it makes the quilt instantly bigger. If you have a 12-inch block and you do it on point, which means you're going to tip it on a 45-degree angle, I think, that 12-inch block has now turned into a 15-inch block. So you're going to make your quilt bigger right away, but the coolest thing about on-point setting is it makes the quilt just cooler. I actually had a hard time finding samples I'd made with a straight set. I rarely put blocks in a straight set. I just don't find it as interesting. So with these next ones, you're going to see an on-point setting. So this applique, here's the blocks, and they're actually on point. So this is done with the use of a setting triangle, a corner triangle, and a setting square, this one in the middle. So this block, this quilt is on point. This quilt is on point, and it also has sashings and cornerstones. So I had these rather busy blocks going on, so I added the gold with the cornerstones of turquoise. Give me a little bit of resting place for my eyes, kind of calm it down a little bit. And then I used this multicolored print to put it on point. So my setting triangles, corner triangles. In this case, no setting block or setting squares. It's just another block. This is a quilt that I showed you earlier where I did the coping strips in the green. So you can see the green here. In this case, again, it is an on-point setting, but the sashing strips, instead of just being a solid piece of fabric with a cornerstone, I actually paper pieced a funky cool point here so that this quilt is even more interesting. So it's got the cool blocks, the coping strips going around each block, the sashing strips that are done in a paper piecing technique, and it's on point with my setting triangle and my corner triangle. Again, no setting squares in this quilt. And the last one is really cool because I took those blocks, I turned them on point, and I put 4 blocks together, and then for the corner triangles and the setting triangles, I used a stripe fabric. The first time I used a stripe fabric to do setting triangles and corner triangles, I was so worried that the stripes on the fabric would end up going in all different directions. It doesn't. When you take that setting triangle and cut it into quarters and take them corner squares and cut them into the corner triangles, you can get the stripes to continue to run in the same direction. So not only is this block cool because it's set on point, but then it's super cool because I also used a stripe fabric in the setting triangles and corner triangles. So we're going to work on these blocks that we made earlier with the wonky setting, and we're going to set this quilt on point. If there is a difficult part about setting blocks on point, it's that there is math involved. Or you could probably find something written in some book with all the information you need. But I'm going to tell you about the math. So these blocks I squared up to 15 inches. That means that the finished size of this block, after I take my 1/4 of an inch off of both sides, is 14.5 inches. The math for setting triangles is to take the finished size of your block, in this case 14.5 inches, and multiply it by 1.41. Then take that sum and add 1.25 inches. So you'll add 1.25. In this case, for this block, that'll bring it to 21.75 inches. So I always round it up to the quarters just to make it easier. All right. So I've got my big squares, and this is a very large square. You're going to find it very difficult to cut a square like this. My ruler just is not long enough to cut that. So this is how I do it. I'll take that square that I've made and fold it in half. I've got a center point here from the square, from the pressing. I just folded it in quarters. So this is the middle. I'm going to take my ruler, line it up to the point, bring the bottom of it to that square in the middle, line up horizontal on the ruler here with it at the point and at the square in the middle. I'm cutting it once. So now I have two large triangles. I'm going to line them up one on top of another and do the same thing. From that creasing again, I have my center at the bottom. Going to line up a horizontal line of my ruler on the straight edge that I just cut all the way to the point and down to the square. Now I have setting triangles. So let me tell you a little bit more about setting triangles. With a setting triangle, I've taken and cut that in quarters. Okay? Remember at the very beginning we talked about the anatomy of fabric. And with the anatomy of fabric, you have length of grain, the width of fabric, and the bias cut. I have just made these squares make the long side of the triangle be the straight of grain. This is not going to stretch. The center part of it is bias cut. These can be very, very stretchy. So before you cut the square the size you need it, you want to spray size it. You want to stiffen up those fabrics so that after you cut it, this bias edge is not going to be able to stretch that much. You're still going to need to treat it with caution, but it's not going to be as dangerous as if you don't. So there is all my setting triangles. The next is my corner triangles. Now the corner triangle, the math for it is to take again the finished size of our square, in this case 14.5 inches. We're going to multiply it by 1.41, divide it by 2, and add 7/8 of an inch, which is 0.875. In this case, that's going to bring me to, I think it's 11.25 inches. So on this square, I've got straight of grain going around all the edges. I'm going to cut it on the diagonal, right down the middle, lining up my ruler from point to point. Cut right down the middle. Now I have corner triangles. The third part to a block being set on point are setting squares. So in this case, they're going to be the exact same size as my block. So now I'm going to lay this block down. Here is my setting square. My blocks going around it. I wish my table was bigger. They're going to all go around it. And then the setting triangles, nope, that's the corner triangle. Here it is. Setting triangles are the larger ones. The setting triangles go on the sides and on the top. So here's the sides. Then one would go here, and then I'm going to have to move this all real quickly. Then the corner triangles, those smaller triangles, go on the four corners of the quilt. So that is going to be gorgeous when I get it done. Someday I'll get it done, and I'll be sure to show it to you. Now we've done all the math and the technique for making our setting triangles, corner triangles, and setting squares. Now I want to show you how you'll work that all together with the blocks that you've been making in the Learn to Quilt quilt. So in the Learn to Quilt quilt, the setting squares and triangles are going to be in the quadrants. So this is a quadrant. There's 4 quadrants in the quilt. We have our rail fence blocks. Remember, we made those in one of the very first episodes. Then we made our sampler blocks using the half square triangles and flying geese. And then here you can see the setting triangles, the setting squares, and the corner triangle up in the top. So in the quilt that we've been working on, this is the new colors. Here's my rail fences, setting my sampler blocks with the half square triangles, and then these are the setting triangles, a setting square, and the corner triangle. Now, the first thing you need to assemble is you need to put the setting square with the 2 setting triangles. This is going to create a large setting triangle. So we're gonna, first we need to take our blocks. So I did the math. The finished size for this quilt is a 4-inch finished square. I did the math, and for my setting triangles, I've come up with a 7-inch block. Now I'm going to cut it on the diagonal. So line it up from point to point. Cut it right down the middle. Then carefully lift your ruler without disturbing the fabric and just rotate the block. Now we're going to cut it on the other diagonal. And that is going to create our setting triangles. Now we're going to take those with our setting squares and make a large setting triangle. So you want to take the setting square and put it on top and line it up so that it is square with the setting triangle underneath. And whenever possible, try to put the bias cut piece, so in this case the setting triangle, on the bottom. The bias is stretchy, remember? So the feed dogs on your machine are always going to feed a little bit faster from the bottom. So when possible, put the stretchy or the bias part down on the bottom. So I'm going to sew this with my square on top, triangle on the bottom. I'm going to start as always with my little leader. I've got my machine set up with the scant 1/4 inch. I'm using my guideline here at the edge, and I've moved my needle over so I have my scant 1/4 inch. And I'm going to start sewing at the corner of the block. Stop, line it up a little bit, and go. When I get to the end, as always, I'm going to go and grab my little ender, sew off on my ender. So now I have assembled that one setting triangle onto the setting square. Let's press that. Very carefully when you press it, because it is a bias edge, just be real cautious that you remember that's stretchy. Just be cautious. Press that. Now I'm going to take and set my other setting triangle. This time, I'm not going to put the triangle on the bottom. I'm actually going to put the square on the bottom, but I'm going to line up the setting square and the triangle so the square edges are together. Going to sew all the way off. Pick up my ender. Now we can press that one, setting the seam first, carefully flipping it up because there is still a bias edge. And that's created our larger setting triangle, okay? Now we're going to assemble those with our rail fence. So going back to our quadrant that we've made, we're going to assemble the quadrant in rows. So the first row is going to be the bottom row that is going to have our large assembled setting triangle on the two ends, our rail fences, and then our sampler blocks. That's going to be one row. Our second row, so let me fold this down. Our second row is going to be our setting squares and triangles with just a rail fence. And then we're going to end with our third row, which is a corner triangle. So for the assembly of the top row, we're going to take the rail fence, a setting square and triangle with a setting square and triangle. So when you're assembling a quilt like this, you really want to start looking at the way the seams are pressed. So in this case, this seam on the setting triangle naturally wanted to go down on both sides. Well, it just so happens that when I created the rail fence blocks, they actually wanted to go down also. So now this seam intersection, both of those seams are going down. That's going to be way too bulky. I'll never be able to get that intersection to be really crisp if I have both seams going in the same direction. So what I'm going to do, this seam is going to my right. The one that goes on top of it, I am going to force that seam over to the left, and I'm going to butt them right together and pin it. So now when I sew this, I'm going to have that little seam be a little bit wonky, but it'll work out in the end, trust me. Go over and sew this. Now when I get to where my pin is, I want to stop and be very cautious, make sure that my seams are going in the right direction, and I am going to sew over that pin. All the home ec teachers in the world are now turning over, going, no, you can't sew over pins. Yes, I can. I can do whatever I want. Also, while I'm sewing this, I'm being cautious. I can feel the seams underneath, so I'm trying to make it so those seams don't get turned in the wrong direction. Let me grab my ender and sew off. Now I'm going to add my other side. Now this time, this seam on the rail fence is going down. This seam on the triangle is going up, so I don't have to do that little flip. I'm just going to match those seams, butt them right together, put a pin in. I don't want it to move on me. And I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to sew this time from the square side up, so I can watch those seams. So I'm watching those seams, making sure that they don't flip up as I'm sewing them. I'm going to position it and sew right over that pin. Just don't tell your sewing machine mechanic that Nancy said it was okay to sew over pins. If you happen to land on a pin, it can cause some timing issues. Just don't land on a pin and you'll be just fine. Come in with my ender. So now I'm going to press. Remember that funky one there that I had that little seam going in the opposite direction? I'm going to press that flat first. Give it a good steam. Now I'm going to press it up. Go to the other side. And now it's time to add my corner triangle to the top. All right. So one little tip I'd like to give you here is for adding the corner triangle, you really need to find the center of the corner triangle. So my favorite technique for doing that is to fold it in half, take a pair of scissors, and just nip just the tiniest little clip out of there. So then I know right where the middle of that triangle is. Right there I can see it. Now I'm going to take the middle of that triangle, line it up with the middle of my rail fence block, pin it in place, and again, I'm going to sew from the back side, that's the larger side, which kind of seems odd. You generally sew with the smaller piece on top, but in this case, I want to be watching these seams, making sure that I'm not flipping seams as I go, and because the corner triangle is stretchy because it's bias, that's going to help feed that through more evenly underneath. Gotta watch this seam right here so it doesn't flip up. Grab my ender. And press my corner triangle up. So that's going to be row 2 and 3, and with the magic of television, you'll see how I've got my first row, my second row, and my corner triangle. In subsequent episodes, I'll teach you, or I'll talk to you about how you're going to trim these points here to make your quilt square before we put the borders on. But for now, this is going to get the quadrants of your learning to quilt all finished. Hope you enjoyed it.